My name is Kathy, and I would like to welcome you to the library, and hello to those that are watching through live stream. I would like to ask you before you leave if you would stop and fill out the questionnaires that we have on the back table. It does help us with future programming. I would like to introduce you to Jessica Kowalski. She is an archaeologist at the University of Arkansas, the Fayetteville Research Station of the Arkansas Archeological Survey, and assistant research professor of anthropology at the University of Arkansas. Jessica's presentation today is Archaeology of the Ozarks. Let's welcome Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I see some familiar faces out there. It's always nice. Thank you so much for coming today. So I'm going to talk about archaeology here in the Ozarks. I'm going to talk about Native American history and what we know about Native American history through the archaeology until colonization or European contact. So before I get started, though, I just want to talk a little bit about what I do, what my job is. So I do work, as Kathy mentioned, for the Arkansas Archeological Survey, and my mission there is threefold. I'm tasked with creating a research program that is Ozark specific, so I'm supposed to identify the gaps in the research record and design a program that can be used to address some of the gaps, asking questions about the archaeological record, basically identifying what we don't know. Another one of my tasks, I'm in charge, I manage collections and archaeological data, so I have a curatorial role or a stewardship role. And finally, I engage in public education and outreach events, communicating what we find to the general public and doing events like this. So the Ozarks, which is a place I assume we all live here, we know it well. It has a unique landscape and some unique landscape features that have affected the archaeological cultures here in the past. So the Ozarks, as we know here in Northwest Arkansas, are part of a broad physiographic province that we call the Ozark Highlands or a plateau. They're really old weathered surfaces that have uplifted over time, and some of the unique features of the Ozarks are some what we call karst topography. That means there's a lot of limestone here that's eroded, so we have some sinkholes, we have these dramatic bluff lines, and sort of narrow river valleys. And this means that the Ozarks was wonderful for a lot of things, but large-scale agriculture, like in the Mississippi Valley or like we see in eastern Arkansas in the Delta, was not really possible in the same way here in the Ozarks. That's not to say, and we'll talk about this, Native American Indians certainly engage in agricultural practice and horticulture, but it just is a different type of landscape, as you all know, compared here to the Mississippi Delta. And here's a few images here. Maybe some of you will recognize. These are places here on the Buffalo River. Absolutely gorgeous. We all love the buffalo. And the buffalo is again characterized by this kind of somewhat narrow river valley, especially when you're thinking of it in comparison to the Mississippi River Valley. And also, here's a dramatic bluff line, which are common here in the Ozarks. So the Ozarks would have been a very attractive place to live for Native American groups in the past, and I'm sure you can understand or figure out why. There's rich animal and plant resources here. All the typical animals, bear, deer, small mammals, and smallmouth bass. Fishing was an important subsistence practice in the past and today. I always like to show this image here is the little black bear. I show it in all my presentations. I saw him on Kessler Mountain. So that we all know the black bears here are alive and well just down the street. So it was a very critical, black bear was a very critical resource for a lot of reasons, for food, for pelt, for oil, all throughout Native American history and into colonial times. So I'm going to start with talking about some of the archaeological resources here in the Ozarks that make this area internationally known. We have some very special kinds of archaeological resources that are not very common across the world, actually. Bluff shelters here in Arkansas have an international reputation. Bluff shelters are exactly what they sound like. They're sort of eroded limestone and sandstone overhangs and bluff lines that have a little bit of space underneath, and Native Americans utilize this space for temporary campsites, for storing or caching seeds and other types of material items. And they were also ceremonial. Some bluff shelters were ceremonial in nature. And we know that they were very important spaces in that sense to Native Americans because occasionally bluff shelters would have burials, and also some bluff shelters are known to have rock art. I know I'm going to show a line drawing on this in a minute. I know it's a little difficult to see here, but these are two rows of anthropomorphic figures. This is at a site called the Narrows. It's located a little bit east of Mountainburg, and it's in the Ozark National Forest. It's a very famous site. It's got a very complicated, actually, series of panels of rock art. And let me show the line drawing will give you a little bit better sense. So here's the famous panel. It's one of a few at the site. It's two rows of anthropomorphic, they're people, imagery of people, with one image here that has been interpreted to be an important person in the society with ceremonial regalia. It's probably a headdress and a sacred stick, and it's been dating rock art is incredibly difficult. It's hard to directly date it, but there's been some materials from this bluff shelter, paints and tools that have been associated with charcoal that have given a radiocarbon date of about AD 1450. So we think this material falls into that 15th to 16th century time frame. So it is, so we consider it ancestral Osage. And so we think this may be the playing out of an Osage creation myth or a ceremonial dance. These are just a few other images of rock art. There's actually, and I'm straying a little bit out of the Ozarks technically, but there's a concentration of rock art on Pettigene Mountain and in other mountains along the Arkansas River, but they're good examples of the different kinds of rock art we see in bluff shelters. We have sunbursts here. I wouldn't say sunbursts are terribly common, but there are more than a few instances of sunbursts. We also, again, we have lots of what we consider to be anthropomorphic figures or people, and a lot of natural imagery, so animals, plants. This we call zoomorphic is just the technical term for these type of rock art. And rock art can be painted red. It can be pecked with a tool, as in a pictograph. I've always liked this rock art image. It was on my title slide. I should have put it in here. My favorite rock art image is a fiddlehead. It's not a fern, a fiddlehead. I'll show it at the end of the talk so you guys can see. It's a really interesting, and it's natural subject. The subjects of rock art are a lot of natural things in the natural world. So apart from the rock art, and we know that the important ceremonial nature of bluff shelters, how these are sacred sites, particularly to modern Osage, consider bluff shelters to be very sacred sites. We've learned a lot from bluff shelter material because things preserve so well in bluff shelters. So many bluff shelters, there's not a lot of water action into the soil, so organic material tends to preserve a little bit better. So there are materials in bluff shelters I've never seen on archaeological sites in my whole career till I came here to the Ozarks. We have basketry fragments here. This is a moccasin. We have a few examples of these in our collections in the University of Arkansas Museum. We know a little bit about twine, so we've learned how Native Americans made baskets at this time and the type of material they used to make baskets. And we actually have a few examples of these seed bags. This is a bag here. It's about this large. It came from a bluff shelter near Beaver Lake, and it's still full of seeds. So we've put it, the University of Arkansas have put it through a micro CT scanner to figure out what kind of seeds are in the bag and how many seeds. And archaeologists have figured out it's a mix of what's called chenopodium. I'll talk about that in just a moment. It would look to you today just like a grassy, seedy plant on the side of the road, but it's called, the common term for it is goosefoot. But at a time, it was very important to Native American diets throughout history. And I think there's a little bit of sunflower seed in the seed bag as well. So that's a good segue into speaking about the seeds. The bluff shelters are also, not only because they have this spectacular material that we don't find on sites elsewhere, we have learned from bluff shelters that the Ozarks were a place of independent plant domestication. Because we have such great preservation, we have seeds that are intact, that are not necessarily carbonized. On other sites, seeds sometimes preserved because they've been burned, but we can actually look at seeds that haven't been burned and determine a little bit about their physical characteristics. And archaeologists have looked at these seeds in depth and have identified native cultigens. So this means that Native Americans were starting to select. So there was natural, for instance, natural chenopodium in the environment, and then we have evidence that Native Americans were selecting plants for larger seed cases, more dense seeds on the plant themselves, and we can really see that here in our collections. Some other plants that were probably independent, so also domesticated elsewhere, but sunflower was another domesticate that probably happened independently here in the Ozarks. We also find a lot of bottle gourd in bluff shelters. Bottle gourd, again, I've never seen bottle gourd on another archaeological site here in bluff shelters, but they preserve so well. There seems to be bits of bottle gourd in just about every bluff shelter that has archaeological materials. We've also learned a little bit about the stone tool industry in a way we haven't been able to see on other types of sites because, again, the organic materials preserved. These are actual artifacts. They're in Smithsonian collections. We've learned about how projectile points were actually hafted onto wooden shafts here. So we actually have the twine and evidence of tar on this projectile point. This artifact here is an unusual one. This is a deer jaw. It's too lightweight to be have used in sort of heavy-duty work, heavy-duty gardening. It was probably used in some sort of very light clearing or very light garden maintenance. And we think that these type of artifacts here, this axe hafted into this piece, pretty heavy-duty piece of wood, we don't think these are weapons. These are probably land clearing tools used to make garden plots in and around or near these bluff shelters. So the Ozarks are home to more than just bluff shelters. We have open sites, and we've learned a fair amount of those as well. But I think for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about the timeline of occupation, what we know about Native American occupation in the Ozarks through time, and I'm going to highlight a few important sites and what we think we've learned about the archaeology and how cultures have changed over time. So well, I have a caveat. I'll talk about Paleo Indian, but we really don't have great Paleo Indian evidence here in the Ozarks. But we know that Native American groups were in the Americas by 13,000 years ago, actually much earlier. There are really good dates now from a site in Florida called Page Ladston that's pretty universally accepted now that had 15,000 years ago. I know there's been some things in the news lately about people in the Americas maybe as old as 20,000 years ago. The artifactual evidence has yet to catch up with that. But in Arkansas, we have a pretty good grip on the fact that Native Americans were here at 13,000 years ago. And I'll talk about that just a little bit more. And then the other major time periods, we have Archaic, Woodland, and Mississippian. And those are just the broad ways we break up the archaeological record. And each time period has certain characteristics that make it distinctive from the other time periods, and we'll talk about that. So moving into Paleo Indian, many of you may recognize these type of projectile points. Sometimes it's in the news, the term Clovis or Clovis culture. Clovis projectile points that look like this, Clovis points, are found all over North America, and they are found in Arkansas, but we haven't really found Clovis points in the Ozarks, at least in good context. So there are Clovis points that have been found in much better context in the eastern part of the state, Crawley's Ridge area. There's been a Clovis point. This is a spectacular and very rare example of a Clovis point that's made out of quartz crystal. This was found in the Ouachitas near Hot Springs, and it was the only reason it was found. It was very deeply buried, and during the building of one of the dams there near Lake Catherine, a very deep deposit, a tractor pulled out a Paleo Indian deposit, and that's where this projectile point was found. But other than that, in the absence of having that type of access to very deep deposits, we just really don't find Paleo Indian material here in the Ozarks. And again, because it's so deeply buried, we don't find it, or our Paleo Indians haven't made their way into the Ozarks yet. That's a major research question we have yet to answer. Archaic culture we can say a little bit more about Archaic period culture in Arkansas. This is a time period where those groups, as we know, Paleo Indian groups came into Arkansas, and they probably came down the Mississippi River and Ohio River valleys, and then we call this Archaic time period a period of settling in. So Paleo Indian groups moved into these river valleys, definitely moved into the Ozarks at this time about 10,000 years ago, and started making use of the local resources, making projectile points on local chert, hunting native animals and using native plants, and really settling into the landscape. And we have good evidence of archaic populations all over in bluff shelters and in open air sites in the Ozarks. It actually gives the impression that there is a population increase, and that's pretty much true across the southeastern U.S. These are examples of sort of typical archaic. We think these are spear points. This is before the invention of or the innovation of the bow and arrow. And archaic groups they're harvesting, and here in the Ozarks, this is a grinding stone. They're harvesting a lot of nut mast. Acorn, hickory nuts were a major part of the diet, and then also mammal and fish resources. So I want to highlight a site here in the Ozarks where we've learned a lot about archaic period occupation. This shelter is on Beaver Lake. It's not far from the dam. It's called the Breckenridge site. It's popular in archaeological literature because archaeologists with the Smithsonian who excavated at the site in the early 1900s found a flute. We don't often find musical instruments on sites, but again, with the kind of preservations we have in bluff shelters, Breckenridge has produced some spectacular artifacts. This is an image of the shelter during a 1964 excavation, and then archaeologists with the survey and some of our volunteers worked at the site in 2012. And why I wanted to mention it today, here's a picture of what a bluff shelter excavation looks like. It can be a little tricky logistically with lots of rock fall and roof fall, and you have to be very careful excavating it from a safety perspective. And also these sites can be very deeply stratified. That means, which is a good thing for archaeologists. It means that the younger material is on top, and the deeper you excavate, you can find the older material. And what the archaeologists found here is they were digging down, they would find projectile points, what we call in situ, that seem to be in a good context, that were either dropped there, lost. They didn't seem to be washed in by a major flooding event. They're good signposts for what time period we're excavating in as we go down. This is a good example of what we call a middle archaic point, so probably 5,000 to 7,000 years old. And as archaeologists continued excavating, they found this point here, which was a very interesting find. It's called a Dalton point, and particularly a Breckenridge Dalton. It's got its own type name, and next to the projectile point was a small hearth, and archaeologists were able to get a piece of charcoal and radiocarbon date that point to about 10,000 years ago, 9,700 years ago roughly. It's a little late for what we have thought. It's called early archaic time period, this Dalton culture, this time of settling in. It's made on local chert, but it is the oldest radiocarbon date we have now in Arkansas. So pretty good context. Interesting dig that has showed us how projectile point styles changed over time, and we know early archaic people, the first people who really settled into the landscape here in the Ozark, were utilizing bluff shelters pretty heavily. Following that early archaic time period and what we know about dates and projectile point styles, what we see is almost a period of stability for many thousands of years. We know that Ozark residents were hunting and gathering. We know they were highly seasonally mobile. We know they continued to use bluff shelters and open air sites. What we don't know, again, coming back to the research questions, what we want to find out about the past, we don't know how these populations were structured. We don't know much about their family units. We don't know a lot about their political organization. We can make some inferences based on comparing these semi-nomadic or seasonally mobile groups to other archaic groups in the Southeast. We can sort of extrapolate or make a guess that these were probably small bands of people that came together at certain times of the year to group up, to exchange goods. But we don't really have great evidence of that. What we really would like to find are some big archaic villages. And to this point in the Ozarks, I suspect they may be out there, but we don't have good evidence right now of a settled village life for archaic groups, probably still very seasonally mobile, following resources. And we know this was a very adaptive, successful way of life for thousands of years. It didn't change very much, at least what we know from the archaeological record. And again, how we know that we have these sites on these deposits, it's by changing projectile point styles. These are archaic projectile point styles. We know that projectile points just change stylistically over time, and that's how we can associate a particular site with a time period, just by looking at the shape of the projectile point. This is where what I study, my interest in archaeology, were a time period where I think things get very interesting in the archaeological records, a time period called the Middle Woodland. And I have to step out of the Ozarks for just a moment and head over to eastern Arkansas in the Delta at a site called Helena Crossing, just to put this time period in context and then talk about how sites in the Ozarks might relate. So there was a mound center right in downtown Helena on the river. Unfortunately, it's been totally destroyed, which is unfortunately a little too common, especially in the Delta. But there were professional excavations there in the 50s by an archaeologist named James Ford, and he found. I know these images; they're older images. They're a little hard to read, but these are a series of mounds. So these are earthen monuments built by a group of people for a ceremonial purpose. And in these mounds, there were very elaborate burials, and some of the burials were placed. It's the first time we see this in the archaeological record in Arkansas. Some of these burials were placed in very deep shafts that had very large logs lining the shafts, almost like, we don't really use the word tomb in southeastern archaeology, but they're probably the most similar analog to what people in other parts of the world called a tomb. And these burials, it's not very many people. It seems to be a specific subset of society are buried in these contexts. And they're buried with long-distance exchange items like marine shell that came from the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic Coast. They're buried with copper that probably came from the Great Lakes region. They seem to be fancy artifacts. And so what's interesting about that site from a particular perspective is, are we starting to see the evolution or the development of political hierarchy? Are we starting to see chiefs that have power, or are we starting to see the elaboration of a ceremonial sort of way of life, of a religion? And how do you really tease apart the two things in the archaeological record, which can be very difficult to do? But the Middle Woodland period, we can actually start to ask these questions because we have the archaeological data to look at that. And in Archaic period, it's much more difficult to do. It's still a worthwhile thing to try to learn, try to study archaic social and political organization. We just don't, the artifacts that we have, it's mostly stone tools. We can mostly talk about adaptation and environmental adaptation and how people move through the landscape. It's much harder to talk about social structure. So bringing this back to why did I talk about this site and bringing it back to the Ozarks? We do have, this is these aren't from the Ozarks, these pottery images. This pot is from a site in Louisiana called Marksville, and these are just examples of pottery from this Middle Woodland time period. They have a very particular designs. They have very wide line, what we call incisions that zone these areas of stamping, and sometimes they form these motifs, they're raptorial birds. This is a very particular type of pottery style, and some of this pottery has been found in bluff shelters here in the Ozarks. So the question is, are these Middle Woodland peoples moving into the area? Are Ozark peoples participating in sort of a pan-regional exchange of ideas and mortuary? Well, we don't know anything about the mortuary program for this time period here in the Ozarks. So there's a lot of questions about Middle Woodland. It's a little bit of, it's an area that needs a lot more research. And bluff shelters have produced pottery, but we need to do a little bit better job of putting that in context. The next period I'd like to talk about, and again, it has to do with earthen mound construction. And again, we have to pull out of the Ozarks just a little bit, and we have to look south of Little Rock, Arkansas. There's a large site, if you've ever been there, it's called the Plum Bayou Mounds Archaeological State Park. It's a beautiful park. These are two very large mounds here that are on the edge of Mound Bayou or Mound Pond, which is an old channel of the Arkansas River. This is a topographic map of the site. So here are the two big mounds here, and you can see other little mounds encircling a plaza. So this site, it's 400 or 500 years later than that site I mentioned, Helena Crossing, and it's many orders of magnitude larger. So the idea here is you would need a much larger population coming together to create these mounds. And what's interesting about the site is that there's not a lot of evidence of actual residential occupation. So it doesn't look like people are living at the site. They're coming to the site periodically to engage in ceremonial activity, such as large-scale feasts. There's some evidence of what we call archaeological features or pits that seem to be single event or are deposited in a very short amount of time that are just full of animal bone and pottery and stone tools. It looks to be the remains of one big celebration. And we use the term feast in archaeological contexts. So people are elaborating ceremonialism, but there's not a lot of burials at this site. We don't see that same pattern of burial like we saw at Middle Woodland sites. So the question here becomes, well, again, what's the political structure? Are we starting to see chiefs because you would need a massive planning operation to build these kinds of mounds? This is an engineering feat. Somebody would have to be directing the labor, but we don't see that in the burial program. We don't necessarily see people set off from others in terms of material goods. We don't necessarily see have and have-nots in that way. So those are the research questions that sort of go along with this time period. So what's going on in the Ozarks then? Well, this is going on in the rest of Arkansas and across the southeast. And this Plum Bayou Mounds is one of many big. So Plum Bayou is quite large, but there are other what we call mound and plaza centers that are being constructed at this time period throughout the Mississippi River Valley and into Louisiana. So it's a large scale trend. So then the Ozarks, there is an interesting site. So we don't have a lot of we do have late woodland evidence, but nothing on that scale of mound construction like at Plum Bayou Mounds. But there is a site in Newton County in a deeply incised river valley. It's very difficult to get to on foot. There's not a lot of road access to this site even today. It's incredibly rural. It's called the Bradley site. This was excavated by society volunteers in the late 1950s, I believe, or early 60s, and it was a dedicated cemetery. What you see here, it's just a drawing of burial locations, and all these black dots are whole vessels placed with this cemetery. So this was probably a small farming community or probably more intensive horticultural than actual intensive agriculture as we think of it today. But what this has told us, this site has become very interesting to archaeologists for a few reasons. So these whole vessels here are tempered, the way they're made, the technological aspects of these whole vessels that are included with those burials, they're tempered with mussel shell. And mussel shell tempering in pottery is thought to be a technological innovation that came along with the introduction of corn agriculture. If you put little bits of mussel shell in pottery and your pottery lasts through the firing process, it becomes a strong, thin-walled vessel that you can place over a fire for very long periods of time. And Native Americans, by and large, ate corn hominy. I mean, they did lots of things with corn, but we know that was a staple of a Native American diet, and corn hominy has to cook down all day. So the technology of shell tempering in pottery and corn agriculture seem to go hand in hand. The interesting thing here, though, these pots date prior to the introduction of corn agriculture in this area. These pots and these cemetery date to about AD 650 to 850. They're very precocious, early for their time period, and innovative. You may have heard the Ozarks and other mountain areas sometimes have a reputation, an unfair reputation for being conservative or, backwoods, but this shows us archaeologically that's not the case. It's innovative. Ozark people were doing new things that then went to spread out across the entire southeast. So that's Bradley is an interesting site that lots of archaeologists have been interested in and have written about. So now I want to move into the Mississippi period and what we know about Mississippi period sites in the Ozarks. This is the period that I study the most, that I have spent my career working on Mississippian sites. I find Mississippian sites very interesting because, again, we can look at these issues of political and social organization. We can talk about how groups may have related to each other in bigger systems. This is an image here that every dot here shows a mound site. So as I mentioned, mounds, earthen monuments built out of dirt that were very sacred to Native American groups, certainly didn't begin in the Mississippi period, as I mentioned, but they intensified. And as you can see here, Mississippian mounds sort of exploded in the Mississippi River Valley and the Delta area. And if you think of eastern Arkansas today, the landscape has been heavily modified through modern agricultural practice, but there were hundreds of mounds in the Arkansas Delta during this time in history between AD 1000 and 1500. Here in the Ozarks, we don't have quite as many, but we do have a few, and I'm going to talk about those sites. But first, I want to talk about Mississippian, take a step back and talk about it a little bit more broadly. So this is a time period where we are learning that people actually aggregated into villages. People were living in settled full-time settlements. They were Mississippian culture, at least in eastern Arkansas, these people were reliant on intensive corn maize agriculture. So they lived in permanent places all year round, tended to their fields, and a lot of changes come with the move to village life, as you can imagine. Then there becomes a sort of need for political structure, a different way you're going to interact with your neighbors if you're living with people every day. These images here, what we call, they're generated from archaeogeophysics, from instruments. These are magnetometry data, and I just want to point out that they show densely packed houses. All these little black squares are houses. There's, in this site here, Parchman Place, it's actually just across the river, Mississippi, even has neighborhoods of houses. And this is a site too, Hollywood, has densely packed houses all around the Mound site. So again, this is a big difference from Plum Bayou Mounds, where I mentioned that there was no residential occupation. These Mississippian sites now, people are living there. And in fact, this image here is from a site, Sherman Mound. It's just south of Blytheville. It has a palisade with bastions. It's the most intact palisade wall I've actually ever seen in the archaeological record. It's really incredible, and incredible that it survived in these kinds of data. I just wanted to show these slides, again, not Ozarks, but this is what has happened in the rest of the Mississippian world in the southeast. I'd like to show this just to show you what a Mississippian house looks like in the ground, what an archaeological context of a Mississippian house. You can see a burned orange floor here, and as it burned, the oxidation goes from bright orange, where the floor was meeting the air, to a dark black, and then many of these houses had wall trenches dug on the side. Mississippian houses tend to be very typical in shape and size. So moving back to the Ozarks now, what can we say about Mississippian occupation in the Ozarks? Well, we have 3 mound sites here. Not a lot of people know that or familiar with the fact that we have 3 mound sites, and they're located in 3 different river valleys. There's a site, the Goforth-Sandom Mounds, which is in the Illinois River Valley, just right almost on the line with Oklahoma. The Huntsville mound sites are located on War Eagle Creek, just north of Huntsville. And then there's a mound site actually really close to downtown Elkins called the Collins Mound. And there's some interesting things about these mound sites I want to point out. What you're seeing here is aerial imagery and elevation imagery combined. So these dots here on the landscape are the mounds themselves, and these sites are all pretty similar in layout and size. What you're seeing here at the Huntsville mound sites are prairie mounds, so that's natural to the landscape. So this tells us that Huntsville mounds are pretty well intact compared to the other sites that probably have been a little bit more damaged by agriculture. But you can see that the mounds surround a plaza, probably empty ceremonial space used for public activities and events. And each site is located sort of between the active channel of these rivers and then what we call relic channels. As you can see, these paleo channels here, they're almost up on islands in a way. So they're 3 different river valleys, somewhat far apart from each other as the crow flies, but they look very much the same. Excavations at these sites were done in the 1980s by the University of Arkansas Field School, and they found very interesting mound summit architecture I want to talk about just briefly. On the summits of the biggest mounds of these sites were these structures that were cleaned out. They were built, so a small platform was built. The structure was dug into that platform, so they were like semi-sunken, if that makes sense. I know that's a little hard to visualize. Then there was a superstructure built over it, a roof, so you had to walk down into the structure, and they had these extended entryways. What you see here are a series of where posts would have been lining an entryway as you walk down into the structure. There was no hearth, no artifacts in the structure that made it look like it was a chiefly house or someone's residence. In fact, the archaeologists who excavated these structures argued that they were special purpose ceremonial structures, something that they called charnel houses, which is a term for a structure where people process the dead. may have been some amount, we know this from some ethnographic history, that sometimes groups would keep ancestral remains or human skeletal remains in a charnel house till a certain point in a ceremonial calendar, and then they would take those remains and then bury them at a designated spot at a designated time. So if that's the correct interpretation, here's what these houses looked like in plan view. So they had big posts in the center. These are drawings of where posts would have been in the ground, posts lining the sides, and these extended entryways leading down into the structures. So what's interesting about that mound summit architecture, and these are Mississippian sites, is that they don't seem to be, again, chiefly houses. So when we're talking about the evolution of political structures, or when do we first really see have and have-nots in the archaeological record, when do we see elite and non-elites, we don't really seem to have that good evidence here. You would expect that this would maybe be a chiefly residence, and the data's a little iffy about if it's a chiefly residence or not. So some interesting things are going on in the Ozarks, and I also want to mention too, going back to these images, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of residential occupation. So you know how I showed those images about the densely packed villages in eastern Arkansas? These Mississippian mound centers don't seem to be that way. They seem to have a lot more in common with that site I mentioned, Plum Bayou Mounds, that was built almost 400 years earlier. So the question becomes, are we seeing descendants of populations that built the Plum Bayou Mounds that have a different way of thinking about their social and political order? Are we seeing groups that maybe migrated in from the Arkansas River Valley, or is this a homegrown Ozark changing ceremonial mound? So mound, I do want to mention this is the first instance of monumental earthen construction in the Ozarks. These are the first mounds that we have. There are much earlier mounds built in the southeast and southwestern part of the state. Here in the Ozarks, it's not a deeply entrenched tradition. It seems to be brand new at about AD 1000. So this is where my research program has picked up. As I mentioned, this is the part of history I'm incredibly interested in. I've directed a field school just south of the Collins Mound site at a non-mound site. Sometimes you learn a lot more about the mound sites themselves if you learn about the places where people were living who built the mounds. What are people doing day to day in their everyday lives? And what we found at Watts Farm, it's a small site on a terrace of the White River between Elkins and Durham. It was recorded in the 1930s, and this is sort of typical of archaeological investigation. This is just about all the field records we have from Watts Farm, so they're not great. But what we do know is that this was supposed to be an earthen house here, and that it had Mississippian pottery and woodland pottery on the house floor. So it may have been a transitional site. So I was interested to go to the site to see what we could learn about Ozark people on the cusp of what we call Mississippianization. Here's just an example of what some of these artifacts look like. These are somewhat large stone hoes, so we know people at the site are engaged in at least, if not corn maze agriculture, but intensive agricultural practice. These are very thick-walled, these are bases of very thick grog-tempered pottery that is more what we consider woodland in age. And then, I know this image isn't great, but this is a Mississippian bowl. It's tempered with shell. It's a wide, pretty large serving bowl, which is not, it sticks out in this assemblage. So I took a field school there in 2001 with the University of Arkansas to try to find this earth house, to answer some questions about how countryside people were living while mounds were being built, if we can see major change in their daily practice. And what we found, I thought this may be a Mississippian house here, and it turned out to be a huge burned rock feature that was about 8 meters in diameter. So what's that, almost 30 feet in diameter, very large, with a sunken base that was probably a large roasting pit. And what we think they're roasting here at the site is acorns and nuts. We think this is a major nut processing site. This is in the northern part of the site. We did a little bit of work down here to the south. And these are geophysical grids, and these dark spots are what we call anomalies. I thought they might be Mississippian houses, or that structure I was interested in exploring. But what we found actually was what we call a midden trench. So see this dark band here of material? This was material that was thrown into a low area on the landscape, and it was full of acorns and hickory nuts, and more of this burnt rock here that was probably used in some sort of roasting or cooking facility. And radiocarbon dates, so for that Midden Trench, we have radiocarbon dates that are between 7 and 800 AD, so a little earlier than I was looking for, but that big rock feature I mentioned gave us a date that's contemporary with the construction of the mounds at Collins, about AD 1050. So what this data has said to me that while, as I mentioned, mound construction was an introduced tradition here to the Ozarks, local Ozark people who may have contributed mound construction labor were still doing the same things they always did. They were still harvesting and producing and roasting nuts, which was a major part of their subsistence diet. I know it's just one thin view of what their whole daily practice would have been, but it seems for the most part that local Ozark people groups were doing local Ozark things, even despite this introduction of mound center ceremonialism. And that says to me that Ozark people had a fair amount of autonomy. Again, talking about the evolution of political structure and hierarchy and elites and non-elites. Ozark people may have not have had any use for that, maybe. Maybe they liked to keep their lifeways as they were. And so to investigate this question further, we need to find sites that date to a little bit later in time, where are people living on the landscape. And we really don't know where those sites are. So that's another major research question. Where are all the people living on the landscape that built these mounds? This is one of the very few sites we have that date to this time period at all. We do have good evidence of bluff shelters with this Mississippian material, though. We find hardly, what's interesting at the mound sites, we find hardly any cultural material. We barely find ceramics. It's just they really seem lightly used. Again, I mentioned there wasn't a residential population, but all these black dots are bluff shelters that have produced a ton of Mississippi period pottery. And so we don't really understand what that pattern is, what's going on there, what explains the fact that there's a lot of pottery and cultural material in bluff shelters, but none on the open sites. So that's an open-ended question that I can't even begin to speculate on that at this point. And the final slide, what I finally want to leave you all with, so we know from historic records we have a good relationship with modern Osages who consider the Ozarks to be their ancient hunting grounds. We know in the centuries between 1500 and European colonization, our pioneer settlements here in the Ozarks, this area was an Osage hunting ground. So we didn't have big village sites, but the Osage used this area pretty frequently. And I'd like to show, this is actually a map of the DeSoto Entrada. So DeSoto trekked across the interior, probably crossed at Memphis. Every point on this map can be argued for a little bit different point or path, but I just want to point out here that DeSoto probably didn't go too far north of the Arkansas River Valley, but that doesn't mean that DeSoto's Entrada didn't have far-reaching effects. That Native American groups living here in northeastern Arkansas were probably very aware of what was happening at this time as DeSoto came through, but they weren't necessarily living permanently in this region. So continue to hunt in this area until pioneers really settled in, and we have our colonial period. So that is a very brief. I tried to summarize a lot of ancient history here in the Ozarks, but what I really wanted to get across was that we have a rich and deep history. There's lots of things still left to learn, especially from our archaeological context. So thank you very much. Anybody have any questions? Fred?
What is grog tempering?
What is grog tempering?
Yeah.
Oh, it's when you grind up other bits of pottery, so broken pots, and then you put that in your paste recipe. It's still a pretty strong tempering agent. It just can't last over fire for 8 hours like shell-tempered pots can. Steve?
A loaded question.
Lay it on me, I'm ready.
The spiral mounds, what's the latest on the evolution from Woodland to Mississippian? Can you tell me about that site? And was there housing there? I'm not aware of much housing there, Spiro.
Spiro is considered to be, there are some houses at Spiro, but Spiro by and large is another one of these major ceremonial centers. This is a big site in eastern Oklahoma. It's not very far from here as the crow flies. But people were probably not living there permanently, or it was just a caretaker population. I mean, that remains to really be borne out with the data. There's been a lot of remote sensing done there lately. But Spiro is pretty solidly dated to the Mississippi period. Now, there is a little bit, are they Mississippians, are they Caddo, are they this, are they that? But they're definitely practicing Mississippian life ways.
Yeah, Caddo influence.
And Caddo influence for sure, and this Caddo, the material culture seems to have significant continuity with Caddo material culture. So and I believe the Caddo consider Spiro to be ancestral Caddo. Yeah, and it's very, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, I think, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
While we're on the subject, what is the latest thinking about the relationship between Spiro and Cahokia?
Well, that's an interesting question. So they share some broad, so Spiro and Cahokia are these two large Mississippian centers that have a lot of iconography, particularly on marine shell artifacts, copper artifacts, but the iconography canons, or however you want to talk about it, diverge. They don't show the same stories, and their styles are a little bit different. So there's definitely some connection, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be that direct. And when Spiro, there are these very elaborate contexts at Spiro, one something called the Great Mortuary, and that are very late, like 1450 AD. I mean, it's very late at Spiro. Cahokia at that time is not a functioning polity as it once was. So there's a connection, but it's sort of tenuous, and it doesn't seem to be very direct.
Yeah, well, some of the literature, older literature that I've read, sort of say that Spiro was a kind of the inheritor of the Cahokia heritage. That it's sort of a successor.
It does seem to be, that is, I would say, a more traditional way of thinking about it. I think now people would be more, I don't want to put words in people's mouth who've researched it, but if I could guess, they would say Spiro developed it very much in its own historical context, but was very much aware of what was happening at Cahokia, and there are some ties, and we can see that in the material culture and the subsistence base. These were both intensive corn agriculturalists and viewed mounds as very sacred spaces. Yeah.
That's all over the southeast, right? That's all over the southeast at that time.
Oh, yeah.
It was widespread.
Very much so. Good questions. That's a good question. You guys are asking the hard ones today.
I have one connected to the Spiro mounds. What do we know about the Kavanaugh Mound in Fort Smith and its relation to the Spiro mounds? Because I know I saw that the survey or the Society one had come into possession of it finally, but I have no idea what's going on with it or anything about it.
The Kavanaugh, so it's a mound. Is it in downtown Fort Smith or just outside?
It's not in downtown.
Yeah.
It's at the south end of Fort Smith, and it's, I mean, almost direct east-west from the Spiro Mounds, which is a little bit further south from downtown. It's like where 540 leaves Arkansas. It's just north of that area, right inside of town. It's in the middle of a neighborhood. Trailer park, as a matter of fact.
I know, it was acquired by the Arkansas Archaeological, the Archaeological Conservancy.
Oh, okay.
And so it's in protected ownership. It's probably related to the spirosphere. So there's a lot of other smaller mound sites. And I think, I didn't go into it too much here, I think our mounds here, Goforth, Sangdon, Collins, Elk, they're all spirosphere. They all have that same kind of architecture, that sunken structure. They're related in some way. Now, I'm not exactly sure the dating of Kavanaugh Mound. It may have been a little bit earlier than like the height of of whatever's going on at Spiro, but it's probably all related. Have you excavated there, Steve?
Tim Mulville,
Oh.
we met him out there about the time it was acquired. There's never been any artifacts, almost none to speak of. And one interesting speculation is that it's close enough to Spiro where it's possibility a fire signal, a line of sight contact is within 10 miles.
Oh, that's
it's
interesting.
as the bird flies, as the crow flies, it's very, very short
Oh,
distance
okay.
to Spiro.
Yeah, but
The
no
only
artifacts.
thing is supposedly in probably pretty
Okay.
intact shape for archaeology if it ever does get anything done with it. Because the only thing that ever happened is the former landowners tunneled straight into the side,
Yeah.
but the rest of the mound is essentially intact, like it hasn't been excavated or anything.
It's probably 30 feet high.
It's big.
I would suspect it's probably like I would guess it's got very characteristic Arkansas River Valley architecture on the summit, if it's intact. And if no artifacts have been found, that also sounds very much like the Mound Centers here. It's probably a special ceremonial area, maybe a satellite. Maybe the old thinking would have been that Spiro would have been the capital of a hierarchical, what we used to call chiefdoms, would have been a capital, and maybe Kavanaugh and some of these other mound sites were satellite administrative centers where they offer tribute up to Spiro. We don't really think that's how it works anymore. It may have just been sort of an outskirt ceremonial site, but that would be an interesting research question. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't comment too much more on that because it's all speculation, but yeah.
I can't remember how many years ago it was, but one of Jamie's last trips, he took a group of us to a bluff up in Bella Vista on Lake Ann, a bluff overhang there. And it was so interesting, and I just wondered if more trips like that are planned, because that was really a wonderful insight. And
we don't have any trips on the books, but if you guys would like to suggest one, I'm happy to take everyone. One that's accessible, because the Forest Service has a trail, is the Narrows. If you ever would like to go down, it's about a 45-minute drive. We could do a Cocoa Sea trip down to the Narrows if you all would like. Yeah, please, we'll invite you along, Kathy. You're welcome to join us. Yeah, we'll load up in the work trucks. We'll go down to the Narrows. Yeah.
Could you speak to recent excavations in this particular area? Because there was one in the news earlier about, I'm thinking.
Great House Spring, the Great House Spring on 112. That was an excavation done because for what's called federal compliance. RDOT's expanding the road there, and they hired, in consultation with tribes and our state partners, they hired a contract firm, a professional archaeologist, to do excavations. So how that site fits into this is one of those, I mentioned that archaic, it's an archaic site. So those open air archaic sites are everywhere, especially at nice spring side terraces, just like Great House Spring. Then we see it in bluff shelters, and we see it near those springs. And that excavation was pretty interesting because they found a lot of what seems to be intact material. So maybe the material, like I said, some of the research questions we have, we don't know what the social structures look like. We don't have real villages. Maybe they're starting to find that kind of thing where people are gathering at certain times of year. You know, if you live in a small enough family group or a band, you do occasionally need to coalesce or come together with other groups for resource support, for marital partners, that sort of thing. So maybe they have a site like that, but haven't seen the artifacts yet. I mean, they'll have to do a little bit of work and analysis and look at the type of artifacts. And a problem they may run into is those sites are usually repeated occupation, many over time, and so it's sometimes very hard if you have 5,000 years of occupation on one landform to really tease that stuff apart. So they have a big task ahead of them. But it's an interesting site, and I think we'll learn a lot from those excavations.
What is the latest thinking on when the bow and arrow arrived in this area, and do they still think it originated in northern Canada?
I think the current thinking is that the bow and arrow, and I hope I'm not, I will caveat this to say, there's a chance I'm wrong about this, but I do believe that it's thought to be an independent innovation in the eastern woodlands in southeastern United States, and the thought that it's a woodland introduction. So 200, 500 AD, we start to see the size and shape of points change. And we really don't have, in a bluff shelter, we do have arrows. We do have cane and small wooden arrows that have been preserved in some of the bluff shelters. We don't actually have a bow, I don't believe. But I think it's thought to be independent innovation about that time. But I reserve the right, if I'm wrong about that, y'all have to forgive me. Well, those are all wonderful questions. So, thank you. Thank you, Kathy.
Well, thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Again, I'd like to remind you before you leave, there are some questionnaires on the table by the door. If you could just jot some notes down, it does help us with future programming. All right, thank you so much for coming.